Vinny here. Before this episode, I just wanted to take a minute to let everyone know about the Omaha Roads to Freedom Unconvention. Now, this is going on Friday, May 25th to Sunday, May 27th at the Embassy Suites and Conference Center in La Vista, Nebraska. Speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Larry Sharp, Nick Sarwark, Dr. Lee Heap Merritt, and more. It's going to be a speakeasy-themed costume ball headed by a steampunk band, so that should be interesting. You can go to www.omahaunconvention.com, and if you use the promo code ThinkLiberty, you can get 20% off. Now, on top of that, they just cut their prices, so if you use our code, you can get a ticket for $40, significantly cheaper than it was when it first started. Think Liberty is going to have a table at the Young Convention. You can come and talk to Chris Oglesby and Caitlin Cloven. Being Libertarian is going to have a table there, too, and there's going to be tons of other people in the Liberty world. So don't forget, Friday, May 25th to Sunday, May 27th, the Omaha Roads to Freedom Unconvention. We'll see you there. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our exploration on political philosophy. I'm Vinny Marshall, and this episode, I guess we could call it like part 2 of the Philosopher series. We don't really know what we're going to do with it yet. We've been talking about making this its own thing, but until then, this is just another podcast episode. Joining me for this episode, we have William Gadsden from Liberty Bites and Liberty on the Rocks. Hello, sir.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here. And we have Chris Oglesby. How's it going, Chris?
Oh, I'm doing great.
All right, awesome. So we're just going to jump right into it. I do want to talk about, before we go forward, I want to go back just a little bit. Well, actually, it's quite a bit, but I don't want to do it for that long. And I want to talk about something that we passed over, and that's Confucius. We did kind of jump into it at a random spot, and we glossed over him, and I just wanted to bring it up because I feel like it's pertinent in the context of what we were talking about on this last episode with Rousseau and where some of those ideas came from. Are you guys familiar with the work of Confucius?
Very vaguely, but I think I'll dive into it in a second after we've kind of done the broad strokes. But as you said, we kind of touched on him, but he's actually pretty crucial to part of Western political philosophy. But I mean, we can't really throw out Eastern political philosophy, especially when we're considering its Eastern civilization's impact on Western civilization in the modern day, in the more international community that we have now.
The broad strokes here for Confucius is a basic idea that a leader should be a superior man and that less than perfect people can be changed by an example of sincere goodness. And that is to say that it's somewhat similar to what Rousseau had kind of laid out, but the difference here is that Confucius was of the mind that people can progress into more advanced states than what he saw as the nature of man. And the next portion of his ideology is that these people that lead, these superior men, should espouse and hold qualities of virtue, faithfulness, sincerity, and it should show in culture as, rituals and ceremonies. And it is basically that this leader is to go out and set an example for people. And Confucius kind of looked at it when he talked about it as a way to where the ruler sets an example for his subjects. And this is kind of like, the wind, right? And the wind blows, and what he said is the grass will bend to the wind. And so the wind is the leader who is setting the example, and then the grass, the people, will take on the example set forth by the leader. I think that's about as good as a summary as I'm able to put together for Confucius. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's actually very, very interesting. And I think that attributed to a lot of Rousseau's philosophy as well. And it kind of transferred down the path that we see in the Middle Ages, where you had like a very strong leader, or you had a king, or, something like that. And it was kind of, I think it was kind of, in response to, it's like, well, this is kind of the way it's always been. There's been the leader, the king, or whoever it may be. And there are kings that are bad. And so they should, he was kind of giving that a little bit of a direction, so to say, I think, Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It was certainly, just by glancing over it, you can tell that the intent was to be, good and virtuous and to lead by positive example.
It's kind of very similar to, the concepts that, the Greek philosophers talked about too, having the 7 virtues and
Correct.
and things like that. I think also in contrast to Confucius, I think we'd be doing a disservice not to mention Lao Tzu. And basically, the Lao Tzu was a philosopher and like religious guru who started the idea of Taoism. And Lao Tzu taught that all straining, all striving are not only vain, but are counterproductive. One should endeavor to do nothing. But this doesn't really mean literally do nothing, but to discern and follow the natural forces, to follow the shape and flow of events and not pit oneself against the natural order of things, to be first and foremost spontaneous in your actions. So it kind of has implications into that, relating to Confucius, where you say the leader's the wind and the followers of the grass, and the grass bends, kind of in contrast to that, where it's like if the natural order of things is for the grass to move or the grass to grow where it may be, then you really shouldn't try to affect that. So it's kind of almost a counter argument in some ways, and that it's that people have their own spontaneous desires and things, and that you can't really predict that, and you shouldn't really go against it. It's almost more of a libertarian, more of an anarchist view, I would suppose, but that might be venturing too far into trying to attribute it to other things. So,
but it certainly seems more compatible to those ideologies. That's for sure.
It also rejected the Confucian attempts to regulate life and society, and counseled instead to turn away from it to a solitary contemplation of nature. So,
right. So it's, for all the positive things about the approach of Confucius, it's quite obvious that what the primary intent is to sculpt the overall consensus and the direction of the collective, whereas it sounds like this is exactly the opposite, where it is to kind of lead with the individual. Right. Anything from you, William, before we move on?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So I dropped out there. I don't know if y'all touched on it, but basically the idea that there's some similarities between Hobbes, the Hobbesian idea of the sovereign, and kind of this overarching leader, and everyone has to trust and follow in the sovereign, and that's kind of what you're going to build civilization around. So there's some similarities there between the Confucian ideas and the Hobbesian philosophy. Coincidental, of course. But another point I wanted to make, I just recently finished reading The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel P. Huntington. It's a very, very good book. It's a little bit outdated when he does some of his predictions, because it was written in, I think, like the early 90s. But when he's talking about these sociological kind of bigger picture ideas, he just really hits the nail on the head, in my opinion. And one of the main things he talks about is these very stark differences between the primary civilizations. So he talks about Western civilization, Eastern civilization, Islamic civilization as kind of being the big three, and how philosophically they were all shaped by very different philosophies, very different figures. So he points to Muhammad, Confucius, and Hobbes, Locke, kind of the guys that we've been talking about for forming the philosophies between all of the different civilizations. But one of the things that he points to is he says that the formation of these philosophies in turn forms the civilizations, which in turn forms the patterns of government that you see in these different civilizations. And I think that's very self-evident. So, for example, when we're talking about Confucius, he kind of leans more towards this is why a lot of Eastern civilizations are built not as much around the individual, but built much more around the community as a whole. And you talk about even when in a lot of Asian cultures, someone is introducing themselves, they don't introduce themselves by their first name. They'll introduce themselves by their family name first, because that takes priority. Very small things like that, but the culture as a whole is built around the idea of the community rather than the individual, which of course lends itself to more socialist or communist models. You have China, North Korea. Um, there was a large socialist movement in Japan in, I think, the 70s, these sorts of things. So his idea that the philosophy lends to the culture, lends to the political model. Just something to chew on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just want to point out, I mentioned the correlation between Confucius and Rousseau. I believe that was more correctly, as you stated, a connection between Hobbes and Confucius. But yeah, the difference being, Hobbes' opinion on the nature of man and the opinion that Confucius had on the nature of man. They are somewhat similar, but different in the fact that Confucius saw it as something that could be progressed through. Okay, so let's get into then Immanuel Kant. We'll start on there, and I'll just get right into laying that out. So if we're going to break down his basic philosophy, the broad strokes, we're going to look at it as there's kind of a overarching philosophy that he had, and the idea is that no generally valid principle of legislation can be based on happiness. So that's the most simple way to put it. And then you can kind of break it down by looking at it as happiness is gained and felt in different ways by different people. Therefore, this means that it cannot be used to generate fixed principles that are equally applicable to everyone. Therefore, laws must be agreed as applicable to all and reflective of the common will. Therefore, no generally valid principle of legislation can be based on happiness. Okay, and it's not so different than saying most people would agree that driving through a red light would not be good if everyone did it. And that's just kind of the basis of the stuff that he wrote about. And so, like, in terms, if we're looking at it in terms of like military intervention, for instance, intervention in Afghanistan may be unpopular with the public in the United States and Europe, but according to Kant, this disconnect does not give individuals the right to withhold their taxes. Right. And so it's just this kind of general idea that if, as was stated there, at the top, no generally valid principle of legislation can be based on happiness. And there's a big, so, with this, there's a big focus on personal responsibility. And then obviously, I think it's very clear in kind of looking over some of these broad aspects, exactly what Kant was able to do to help shape the people that came after him, and talking about philosophies of freedom and liberty. So do you guys want to give your opinions on what I laid out for Kant?
I missed the first part, but I'll chime in with the little bit that I know.
Sure. Well, all I really did was give the broad strokes, which is his general principle that no generally valid principle of legislation should or can be based on happiness.
Okay, because happiness is inherently subjective.
Correct.
Got it. Okay.
Correct.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously that's kind of one of the fundamental basis of our philosophy in libertarianism. The idea that you can't legislate happiness, which is also, that's also a conservative value, but nevertheless, you can't legislate happiness. You can't base something on a group as a whole, so don't even try to do it in the first place. That's the basis for individualism. So what I've talked about before on Liberty Bites, this idea that liberty is inherently dangerous because there's no safety net there's no legislation there, but it is up to you, the individual, to use that to your benefit. Interesting note, and this may be just pure speculation on my part, but I think it's interesting to note that this is sort of the mirror reflection of Machiavelli's ideology. when he kind of set that bomb off and flipped the table on the ancient Greek thought, he said, no, none of these lofty ideas matter. Instead, it's about you as an individual and what you can do for yourself. And obviously, the moral hazards involved are the opposite of what I think Kant was getting at. But at the same time, it's this idea that the focus is on individualism, morality aside. You do what is best for you, and don't let anybody get in your way.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, Chris.
He used the principle that human beings should be treated as ends and rather than means, and that moral autonomy being central to humanity and stuff. Kant definitely had a lot of influences on a very wide and different schools of thought relating to political philosophy, as well. He was also had some religious backings to what he what he propagated as well. And Michel Foucault, who we'll get probably in a later episode, was greatly influenced by Kant as well. So we'll be touching on him in a later episode. But it's I'm actually not very well read on Kant, to tell you the truth. But I do need to delve into him a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, it's just this kind of general opinion that governments must remember that they govern only by the consent of the people. So when you're considering that a lot of these people, they're dealing with things like social contract theory and stuff like this, I think this is a pretty general progression of that kind of idea, that way of thought, in saying that he's essentially admitting that things have to be fair and they have to be balanced, and that it's government by the consent of the people. So we'll move on from that. Let's make sure we had him covered there, and we'll go right to Edmund Burke. For anyone listening, I'll just as I did before, I'll go over the broad strokes here. So if we're going to start with the beginning of kind of his ideas, it's that essentially government is a human invention to oversee human needs in society. Therefore, some human needs and desires conflict with those of other people. Therefore, government must judge between conflicting wants to produce the fairest outcome. Therefore, the individual's passions must be subjected to the government's laws. And one of the most prominent things about Burke in his time is, I believe, he was very against a lot of these revolutions that were popping up. So he, I think, could be probably considered a traditional conservative, and that's made quite obvious that in these times of revolutions he was of the mind that is bad, and you should not be revolting against your government. I think that's about as best as I can summarize it simply.
That's pretty good coverage there. Yeah. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh no. However, he did kind of sympathize, and he sympathizes with America during the War of Independence and with the grievances that were expressed. And he presented kind of a plea to Parliament to repeal the tea duty. But of course, this isn't to say, of course, that he supported the revolution. And he tried to settle the conflict as diplomatically and as peacefully as possible, but of course that didn't happen. So, yeah, he had a lot of comments about democracy as well, and then he had some dealings with India, and so yeah, it's kind of pretty interesting.
So one of the other, to lay the basis here a little bit, and Chris, you touched on it, his dealings with India and kind of his sympathetic views towards the colonies. But he was also, it's important to point out that he was a political philosopher, a political scientist, but he was also a British statesman for quite a while. So he had practical knowledge and experience to back up his ideas. with his political philosophy. So, as was popular at the time, with Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, they're all trying to kind of hammer out what is the nature of man. So, because that was kind of the hip thing at the time, Edmund Burke did the same thing. But his view on the nature of man was a little bit more nuanced. So basically, instead of saying that man is basically evil or man is basically good, Edmund Burke generally said that humanity is simply a copy of its experience. So it's not naturally one way or the other, but humanity is kind of this ball of clay that will be shaped by whatever the individual's experience is, and that individual will go one way or another based on that alone. It's not naturally going to lean in one way or another. Um, that being said, he made it very clear that he did not believe in any sort of equal society. He saw equality or egalitarianism in general as being a violation of the laws of nature, which is really interesting, especially contrasting with someone like Rousseau, who was striving for that kind of society. Edmund Burke said not only is that not possible, to try to accomplish that is a violation of nature, of the laws of nature. In general, as far as kind of flipping the form of government in one direction or another, he was of the mind that no, we just shouldn't mess with it at all. Let's not rock the boat here, y'all. He was also a very strong Christian, as was the kind of primary religion in the West at the time, and his religious beliefs heavily influenced his political beliefs as well. So when he said "let's not rock the boat," it wasn't just because he didn't want revolutions springing up here and there and tons of people dying. It was because he believed that God was influencing and guiding the leaders at the time, and so that was God's will. Let's leave it be. I don't believe that he was buying into the idea of divine right of kings or that sort of thing. It was more just like, hey guys, whatever we've got set up here, it's because God wills it, so we need to just let it lie.
Right. Okay. All right. That's good. I think we covered him well. Is there anything anyone else wants to contribute here before we move? He did have some, I think, important opinions on property rights, but I'm not sure if it's entirely pertinent to go over that.
Yeah, he did have some interesting things about property rights, in that like a government could kind of be constructed out of hierarchical properties. It was kind of interesting, but he definitely did recognize the individual property rights, property rights of the individual. He's also been cited as laying the moral foundations for the British Empire. He is a famous quote by him is that the British Empire must be governed on a plane of freedom, for it will be governed by no other. So it's kind of, and it was the basis of a lot of the conservative philosophies in other places as well. So yeah.
It's so before we move on, just to kind of broadly summarize it, right? It's he basically thought all men have natural rights, right? So he agreed with the whole natural approach kind of laid out by Locke, but he just said that all men have a natural right to food and medicine, for example. Only the methods of procuring and administering them is the important part, right? And using government to kind of sculpt that sort of thing. So we will move right on forward then to Thomas Paine, who would be next. Again, we will summarize quickly. Current rights to vote depend on ownership and property. Therefore, property owners abuse their position of privilege to run society for their own benefit. Therefore, this breeds resentment among the poor, who will rise up against the rich if their needs are neglected. Therefore, rights dependent on property are most precarious. Therefore, rights should be granted without property qualification. So this is huge. This is huge when you talk about modern political philosophy. Why don't you guys go ahead, one of you, feel free to go ahead and explain to people why exactly this is such an important part of the history of political philosophy.
Well, kind of like what I mentioned briefly with Edmund Burke, is that there was, a hierarchical system that was kind of based on different controls of property that existed within the British systems, and for most of, a lot of the histories of like empires and such, that you had, different tiers. You had landlords and barons and, and princes, and they controlled different territories, and what you controlled by what property that was in your trust, or what you controlled, was a not only a social status symbol, but it was a position within actual governmental hierarchy. And with this came with respected rights, or your rights were more respected at a certain level. Thomas Paine kind of flies in the face of this and says, no, it is because people are human that they have rights that are respected, and that what property you own doesn't play into that at all.
Which is huge.
And which is massive. Like that flew in the face of basically what everybody was thinking at the time in the Western world, especially, and the Eastern world.
Right, because you consider historically, for up to this point in time, it's as far as when Paine existed and when he started doing these writings, I think everyone, that he wrote to as an audience was pretty well adjusted to life led by a monarch, or, a feudal construct, and his ideas are completely flies in the face of a monarchy and a feudal construct.
Right. He had also many attacks on Edmund Burke himself. He attacked a lot of his concepts
because he was against the revolutionary approaches. Is that correct?
Yes, he was against the French Revolution.
And that's Burke.
And Thomas Paine, wrote The Rights of Man kind of in response to, or around the same time, he became deeply involved with the ideas of the French Revolution.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff.
William, do you have anything to add?
Oh no, I think y'all covered it wonderfully. Just to emphasize, we're covering. It seems like we're covering a lot of table flippers as far as the political philosophy is concerned. And just to put a slight emphasis on, that's why there's so much focus and celebration around these men, is because they were able to go the opposite direction of what the standard was at the time and say, hey, let's try something new. Let's increase the amount of individual liberty that we have and see how it works. And then you got guys like Marx that, they were still trying new things, and that's the concept is to be celebrated, but hey, that didn't work, so let's not do that again. But it was so, to not to overuse the term, but it was so revolutionary at the time, as you said, to say, well, we've got this hierarchy of landowners and barons and all of these different guys that are kind of the aristocracy, and we should do away with that, but we don't have to do it with a revolution. We can do this peacefully just by giving up a little bit of the power that we have as the aristocracy to people that aren't as wealthy as us. And that's a good thing, and it kind of blows my mind apart that everybody kind of, well, obviously didn't just go along with it, but we went phased into that next step. And that involved all of these very powerful people giving up a piece of their power.
Right. And what I also think is interesting here is, I find it interesting here that you see a lot of times people talk about, liberty forward ideas and political philosophy, and they're often quick to say that, I mean, look, we had not long ago here on our debates, we were talking about, it was the anarchy versus not argument that we had between a couple individuals, and it was made many times in the argument that, it's a path toward feudalism. And I think it's interesting, and not only in the anarchy argument, but this is something you see from the left too, that it's, the people on the right, they just kind of want things to be feudal, that the person with the most money is able to control those below them. And it's interesting to me because the exact founding principles that this country was based on, which is deeply rooted in freedom and liberty, as we're just reading, were principles that were put in place to separate the ability of this control happening. Right. And so I feel like it's a little intellectually dishonest to just run around as people do and say that, oh yeah, sure, these demonic corporations and these demonic capitalists, when it's not the case at all. Is because the very core fundamental founding principles of the philosophies that are espoused by the people that support those things are based in the idea of separating the ability for that power to exist to oppress people in that manner.
It's also interesting to note that around the time of the American Revolution, and he is considered by some to be the father of the revolution, I think is the term that's used quite commonly. It's also important to note that although that he really did agree with the Declaration of Independence as a document and a philosophical concept, he had some comments that were kind of opposed to the Constitution. And he writes in Common Sense about absolute governments, and he basically made the case of why monarchies are bad and why, and kind of why the colonies should move away from the British Crown and everything. But he also makes note that absolute governments and monarchies have the advantage of being simple, and that people can understand them, and if there's something wrong, then they understand where the source of their suffering is coming from. But that if constitutions and governmental systems are complex, it is hard. It was much harder for people to realize that their suffering might be coming from the state, might be coming from a mode of what's going on with the government. So that's kind of interesting to take note of, because how does this get back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Well, the Declaration of Independence, it basically said, no, government cannot do these things, period. Like the list of grievances and so on and so forth. Whereas the Constitution, was felt by him and others that it told government what it could do now. And so it was kind of and it also set up systems in which could have the potential of becoming extremely complex. And I think they kind of did. So
yes.
I think they kind of did, especially on the executive side. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point to bring up. Most specifically for the fact of, I was kind of touching on this a little bit in the last episode that we had when we were talking about the nature of man. And I had mentioned that I'm not really willing to buy into some of the ideas of these early philosophers as it pertains to the nature of man, because I believe in large part that the construct of society that they live in has a great deal to do with what is perceived and observed as the nature of man by these philosophers at that time. These people, as Rousseau and as Hobbes, as much as it's easy for me to sit there and point a finger and to say how antiquated their ideas are, at the time, they were revolutionary ideas, as we have mentioned. And with that said, that means that what they were talking about was an extreme as opposed to what the norm was for the cultures and the societies that they lived inside. Right. And so that is to say that they're trying to come up with these philosophies that will bring people in society into a better place. And they're talking about the flaws that they see in people in society. And they are exalting the state as a way to better refine people in society, but they are also completely ignoring the role that could be played by the state in its influence as an externality into the molding of what they see as the nature of man in people and society. It's fascinating to me. It's very interesting.
No, absolutely.
Sorry, I hope that made sense.
Something funny to note is that loyalists to the British Crown really did not like Thomas Paine at all. And James James Chalmers said, quoted that Paine was a political quack, and that warned that without monarchy, government would degenerate into democracy.
Sure.
Which reading that now, people will kind of look at it and go, wait, isn't that kind of a better thing?
Well, unless you're a Hoppian, that's a completely different.
Of most people who consider democracy to be a good thing, So
sure, and well, what I find funny, and we'll touch into this more when we get into the modern guys. We for anyone listening to, I know that at the end of our last episode, it seemed like we were going to jump into this, but it just really didn't seem right to me to just get right into all these people that we're a little more familiar with, like Hayek and Rothbard and Hoppe, and jump over things like the founding fathers and like Burke and like Paine for this exact reason. Because right now, we're going to get into Hoppe specifically a bit later, and we'll do another part of this. It probably won't be on this episode, but it's important, I think, that we went over what we did, because as we just saw when we went over Thomas Paine, there's a fundamental difference in those who support a monarchy and those who support a democracy, and the nuance behind the reasons for those fundamental differences. Right. And so for people to sit there and say that they support Hoppe, which is fine, and they think that a monarchy is preferable to a democracy, there's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's people's philosophical principles and differences. But it's dishonest to ignore the fact of the value that's placed on democracy. And just because democracy can be mob rule, it doesn't immediately discount all of the principled discussions that went into putting democracy in place. Right. I think it would be hard to read Thomas Paine or to read Thomas Jefferson or, any of these individuals that we're talking about, Edmund Burke and all that, and to walk away from it and say democracy is useless. And, clearly there is something to be said for these kind of veins of thought that they were moving across. And I think it's important to respect those things that were said and take seriously the points that they were trying to make.
No, that's a good point. I mean,
a bit of a soapbox.
That's absolutely fine.
It's really not to piggyback on what you were saying too much, but just to kind of boil it down a bit. It's extremely important for us to understand where we came from and respect where we came from, instead of just kind of being like, oh yeah, those Greeks, what idiots, they laid the foundation for modern philosophy, and that's why it's so important. That's why people still study it today. For my political science degree, before my poli-sci professor would let us go over modern and contemporary philosophers, we had to take a whole class on the Greek philosophers, and I'm so glad he did that. Because we can understand exactly where we came from, be able to understand and explain to others the foundations and the building blocks for where we are now. Otherwise, we could very easily question, well, why is a constitutional republic so great? Well, let me tell you why it's so great, instead of just being like, well, I don't know. It seemed to work out so far,
It's important too, because people will I feel like people get really comfortable asserting things and poo-pooing things, and it's depressing for me, because I read about these philosophers and these people were having open dialogue and conversations, and no one was just saying, no, you're fucking wrong, dumbass, right? Like people were addressing and challenging each other's ideas in honest ways. Just because you don't agree with someone, even if you don't agree with them to the point where their opinion makes you angry, spend more time educating yourself on it and form a good argument that, if not the person that you're speaking with can respect, then those who read and observe your argument can respect. Just by sitting there and pointing the finger and saying that this is stupid doesn't win you any favor except for the people that already agree with you. And at that point, you're really not doing anything at all except for stroking your own ego.
That's really true. And I think something that's been kind of lost in the postmodern era of the past couple generations, especially in America, is that politics has been saturated by the usage of buzzwords and quick phrases that like you say, they just solidify the support of people who already agree with you, and people I would say that the general populace doesn't really take the time to know how to engage in political discussion from a philosophical angle. And say, people say, well, I'm a conservative, and so therefore, I'm this way. And then, or I'm a liberal, and therefore I think this. And, that liberal is the exact opposite of conservative, and things like that. And rather than delving into the philosophical concepts of those political stances, because they began as philosophical concepts. And so when you recognize those, you're able to articulate what you believe in more, but then also be able to win people over. And I think that's an art form that's been kind of pushed to the side in the name of pragmatism. So that's just my view.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. So you, and just to put a bow on it, there's an example of, I guess, how this would go that I want to point out, right? And I don't know why I want to stick on this so much. I just see so much of this stuff kind of turn into team sports and have it become less about people having a discussion about what interesting ideas that these individuals brought to the table. I mean, we joke around. In the last episode, we were saying, like, Rousseau's a fuck and Hobbes a fuck, and that's why we think that. And that's while that's funny and it outlines the things that we disagreed with it, at the same time, I can respect the contributions that they made that led to the people after them taking their ideas and turning them into something different. And that is to say, like, if you were to look at monarchy versus democracy, then one person might say democracy is mob rule, therefore it's garbage. That's fine. It's a fine position for you to have, but it's kind of ignorant in that you are completely ignoring the fact that there is a very real point in time that exists not very long ago when you talk about these political philosophies, especially where a monarchy was just basically used for one person to rule an entire society in the way that they feel it should happen in their opinion. And people are underneath the desires of a tyrannical ruler, right? A monarchy, not very hard to turn bad. And that, I don't think, is a disrespectable position, to feel like you do not want to be under the thumb of inherited power. What if the monarch is not a fair ruler? I think it's a little bit more nuanced and detailed than for people to just poo-poo the concept without looking into why different concepts were presented.
Well, I think that's also, it kind of lends evidence to the idea of humans just wanting everything. And I don't think it's just a modern, ailment. I think it's just always kind of been this way, where we want everything boiled down. We want a binary choice or a binary perspective. And a lot of contemporary political philosophers like Milo Yiannopoulos, insert laugh here, to his credit, he has talked a lot about how both sides want to kind of shove people into a box and slap a label on it. So if you are, if you're a liberal, then you have to believe in all of these different things. Or if you're a conservative, you have to believe in all of these different things, or else you're not really a liberal, or you're not really a conservative. And I've talked on Liberty Bites about this before. Libertarians are no different. Well, you have to believe in all of these things, or you're not a real libertarian, which just drives me absolutely nuts. So I think it's really important when we're talking about political philosophy and we're talking about our personal views on things, we have to be able to, instead of just saying, well, I'm a blank, therefore I believe all of these things. It's very important to be able to dissect your own arguments and be able to, as you said, express those arguments to other people, instead of just going the easy route, And in doing so, that's going to open up an entirely new world of conversation and exchanging ideas and nuance of your own political beliefs and everything else. But we have to kind of cast aside this desire for a binary choice.
Yep, absolutely. Well, people want things to be that simple. People want things to be that watered down because in reality, these are broad, advanced, fluid, and challenging concepts to wrap your head around, to understand, to put into practice. And there's all kinds of ins and outs that are involved in these things. And it can be very intimidating to try to wrap your head around all of it. But that intimidation is no reason to simplify it, because it does a giant disservice to all of the intellectuals in the past that put so much time and effort into constructing these advanced thoughts. And another thing that it does that's absolutely dangerous is it paves the way for ignorance to be the foundation of conversations that are had about advanced topics as time goes on. You have people that are arguing about things, and they don't clearly understand some of the basic fundamentals of the things that they're arguing about. You have people coming to conclusions and arguing about points of things that they don't truly understand, which leads to dishonest conversations about topics that aren't fully grasped, that could only lead to outcomes that are even more disjointed and ignorant than the original misunderstandings. It's a dangerous place to go down, and it's all made a little bit easier if you're just a bit patient and open-minded when critiquing some of these philosophies from the past and how they've attributed to what we believe and what we do now. Anyhow,
I think that was a really
that,
good sidebar, though, to this conversation, and it's something that we really need to take into with political philosophy and conversation in general. But I think it might be time to move on to the next person on our list, which is Thomas Jefferson, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. And so Thomas Jefferson, of course, was one of our founding fathers, and he was president of the United States. And he grew up in a religious family, but he had some, and grew up in a religious family from an early age, and became a statesman later on. He had some, of course, very interesting views on politics and society. And he also had some comments on democracy. He considered democracy to be an expression of society, and promoted national self-determination, cultural uniformity, and education of all males in the Commonwealth. He supported public education and had free press as an essential component of a democratic nation. He also was quoted by saying that the jury system is the only trials is the only anchor yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution. And Jeffersonian government not only prohibited individuals in society from infringing on the liberty of others, but also retained itself from diminishing individual liberty as protection against tyranny from the majority. Initially, Jefferson favored restricted voting to those who could actually have free exercise of their reason by escaping any corrupting dependence on others. So he advocated for enfranchising a majority of Virginians, seeking to expand suffrage to include yeoman farmers who owned their own land while excluding tenant farmers. My mistake. And so this kind of goes along with ideas that Thomas Paine had, but it kind of goes against it in some ways. And I generally like Jefferson as a statesman and just a generally philosophically, but I cannot, and I want to know you guys' opinion on this, I cannot help but notice that he might be picking and choosing some things. What do you guys think?
He absolutely. I think he's absolutely picking and choosing some things, but that's fine. I mean, look, let's not miss the forest for the trees here. Thomas Jefferson was something that right now in libertarian circles is largely looked at as a net negative, and that's a nationalist.
Yes.
Right. He was absolutely a nationalist. And so when you talk about picking and choosing, I think when you consider that, it makes pretty practical sense that these two things are connected. I think what makes Jefferson interesting to me and what makes him significant is this kind of whole idea, as was espoused with the Bill of Rights and everything. This all men are created equal, and they are all endowed with inherent and inalienable rights. And it's something that it wasn't a brand new concept, but it was something that it really, for him, it was the complete foundation of all of his ideas and thoughts.
Very much so.
And obviously people, I think, are quick to point out, and rightfully so, that he was a slave owner. But I think one thing that people don't give him enough credit for is the fact that you can read anywhere that you read about this, that he historically, had giant conflicts of interest with this practice. Right. And so this is a prime example of someone being in a time and a place where something was seen as a regular practice, and he was questioning it. He was writing philosophy that said all men are created equal and they're endowed with inherent and inalienable rights. And then he looks at this construct of slave ownership going on, and he has a big conflict inside himself with it. And you can see this written all throughout anyone who talks about him in this topic. He's a very interesting person, quite the statesman. He was a Renaissance man of sorts. He did a bunch, and from what I understand, he was quite the alcoholic.
He loved his wine.
Well. Oh yes,
he loved his wine. And if you live if you ever are around the area, I would highly recommend going to see Monticello, his mansion, because the architecture and the art is very much. It draws from a lot of different places, and he was in, to art, architecture, making wine, just all over the place, like a whole bunch of different things. He was also very much of a fashionista. He was also very well dressed, sure, as quoted by a lot of the founding fathers. So kind of interesting to throw in there. He also had some ideas about economics, which were a little bit counter to than what was going on in other places at the time. He was very counter to the idea of government banks and public borrowing. And he thought that long-term debt was one of the worst things that a government could do. And this was very counter to his buddies, Hamilton's ideas as well. So that's,
No, Hamilton. Hamilton was a fuck.
I knew it was coming. And
God damn it.
Can we get through one episode?
Can we get through one episode without
labeling someone as a fuck?
But he was a fuck, though. I mean, come on.
He really was, though. I was going through for some Liberty Bites episodes. I've been reviewing my studies on the Federalist Papers, and he says so many good things that I'm like, man, that was just really, his perspective on a lot of things was just excellent. He was able to look at
very
things.
Poignant.
Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to think of the right word here, and it's escaping me. But basically, his perspective on things was from such a way that when you realize what he's saying, you're like, well, why didn't I think of that? But it's like those things that you see it, and you're like, well, that was right in front of my face, but I didn't see it until I read, what he said. And then some other things that he would write about, I'm just like, you're such an asshole. It's
you're right.
It's a love-hate relationship.
Well, that's like the trade-off when when you talk about the kind of stuff that he was talking about, and you have this kind of like practical utilitarian approach, there's going to be tons of time when the rubber hits the road in a way that you read it and you're like, yeah, what an asshole.
Yeah. Okay. Well, back to Jefferson. If I'm not mistaken, didn't he design a lot of Monticello himself?
He did. But of course it was inspired a lot by different designs. Like there's Greek designs. There's even Egyptian inspired things. It's just like all across the board, and it somehow just works. It's amazing. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and he was an inventor on the side as well, not to the extent of Benjamin Franklin.
Oh yeah,
course,
he developed
he liked to.
He developed a transcriber where you could have a pen or a quill pen, and it was a linkage that would connect to another quill pen, And so you could write a document and it would actually write a document next to you. Like, yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah,
even
yeah,
when
yeah.
you went to go, as long as you put the inkwells in the same place, it would even get more ink when you got more ink. It was kind of cool. So
Are you about to have some legal troubles over there, Chris?
that's not for me.
Oh, good.
No, that's me. Sorry.
Oh, no. It's okay.
So getting back to
yeah,
no, go ahead.
That's something I really envy about Thomas Jefferson is like he had so much knowledge and kind of a jack of all trades, but seemingly a master of all of them except for his winemaking, which I wrote about in one of my first articles for Think Liberty about how all of the founding fathers were a bunch of fucking drunks, which I admire, by the way. But
no lie there.
Yeah, look up look up George Washington's recipe for eggnog sometime. It's
oh my gosh,
it's basically 90% different kinds of liquor. It's crazy. and
George Washington ran
part,
one of the biggest distilleries in Virginia at the time.
He also grew hemp on Mount Vernon.
The best part about all these guys is if you read about them, it's funny because you read stuff like about it's funny when you consider, you talk about George Washington and these speeches that they give when they were made president, or how Thomas Jefferson reflected on his time as president. And it's really funny because all the sentiment from all of these founding fathers were just basically like, they were just, you just get the general idea that whenever they were put in a position to have to play these roles as political leaders, it was just kind of an overall bummer for them that they had to be removed from their larger interest, which was basically getting drunk with their buddies and yelling about
and I mean,
politics. Right?
Come on, if you do not think that the Boston Tea Party was like a drunk decision, like, I don't know, like, we're gonna dress up.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you know what? Heck with this tea tax. I hate tea. Let's just throw it all in the harbor. And it's like, wait, what if people recognize us? We'll dress up like Indians. Yes, that'll work.
Dude, I know we're just inundated with podcast projects right now at Think Liberty, but I dream of being able to record skits where we do exactly that.
Like,
juxtapose like a very, very famous quote, like some really deep philosophical quote from the founding fathers, and then just have a skit of us going like, I know it'd be a great idea. Let's dress up as Indians, like that would be hilarious. Anyway, so to your original point with Thomas Jefferson, we went way off the rails there. I love it. But no, he absolutely did pick and choose. But I've heard before, and it is just a theory, but I've heard before that they truly did believe in all of these ideals that they were writing about, but they understood that it would be wholly rejected by society and by culture if they tried to fully implement them. So, all men are created equal. Okay, but good luck actually getting that through, with the culture at the time. So the theory is that they tried to do a little bit at a time. Well, okay, let's introduce, we know we can't get all of this, but we can get a little bit of this, and bit by bit, they had faith that we would eventually build up to the ideals that they had in mind. And, we have sources like the Federalist Papers and personal letters between them that reflects a lot of that.
Absolutely. And so we are at about the hour mark, and I think that's a good place to cut it. I will leave it here, and I'll just provide a general wrap up of Thomas Jefferson as best I can. And we'll basically state it that all men are created equal. They are endowed with inherent and inalienable rights, as I said. And then when you talk about, as we said, this construct of a monarchy versus a democracy, the reason I point out what I point out is because the freedom that most Americans celebrate and most Americans are proud of, I'm sure I'll get a lot of hate from libertarians that listen to this. Now, my collectivism. Look, it's a fact of the world that you have to pay attention to. right? People are proud to be Americans. In saying that, it does not make me a statist. It makes me someone who can observe, collect thoughts, and speak on my observances. So, with that said, he also believed that hereditary rule transgresses the inalienable rights of men. So that's why it's important to notice why he thought democracy was a step up from monarchy, because it's the core principle that hereditary rule is, in a sense, it's immoral because it possibly violates the rights of man. Therefore, only a republic is compatible with the inalienable rights of men. This was Jefferson's idea, of course. So therefore, the colonies must break with the European hereditary rule and become independent republics, right? And so all of what I said before was important to state that, people talk about the importance of Thomas Jefferson, or they talk about how much they appreciate Thomas Jefferson, and it's important to understand why. And it's also important to understand why he advocated for a constitutional democratic republic. So with that said, I think that leaves us at a good place to stop. We've already mentioned, I think, what we'll be getting into next, and that's probably some of this Federalist stuff. And we'll start getting into some of the more modern guys. I don't think we're going to be skipping to the fellows that we talked about in the last episode until sometime here. I mean, we still haven't even gotten into Proudhon or Marx or Bakunin or things like that. And they definitely, I believe, have places in this conversation. Is there anything that you guys would like to share before we end this episode?
If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and plug our other Think Liberty content. First of all, whenever you read Thomas Jefferson from now on, I'm just going to imagine him swinging from a chandelier immediately after making that speech. So check out Liberty Bites and Liberty on the Rocks, the two shows that I host as William Gadsden and my co-host Thomas Kilroy. Liberty Bites is new episodes are posted every Monday, and Liberty on the Rocks is posted every 2 weeks, every other Friday. So check those out on the Think Liberty Network. And as I alluded to in the last episode, I'll give you a little bit more info. We are looking to expand into video format very shortly. So keep an eye out for that. We're extremely excited about it, and we're learning a lot as we go. So bear with us.
All right, that is awesome. And as always, all the places that you can find us. Since this podcast is a little bit different, and I sense it's going to turn into its own thing, like Think Philosophy or something like that. So I'm not going to throw all the Facebook links and stuff at everybody as I normally do, but I will say that for this, I actually do have a book I picked up that helps with cliff notes on these philosophers with these political ideas, and I'd like to go ahead and suggest it to everybody. I did not write this book. I have no skin in the game on this book. It doesn't come from anything that I get money from or anything like that. It's just a book that helped me understand some of these broad strokes of political philosophy, and that book is called The Politics Book, Big Ideas Simply Explained. So if you're into that and you're into these kind of conversations, I would recommend that you go and grab it. I found it at a local Barnes & Noble. I don't even know if those even exist near a lot of people at this time. And I got it for under $20, and it's pretty cool. That's where I was reading my broad summaries that I was kind of laying out to start the conversations with each of these guys. And they do it kind of in a way that we're doing it. And they do it along a timeline, and they give you some easy summaries and understandings of some of these philosophers. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I recommend you can go grab that book, and it'll help get you a better understanding of some of the broad strokes of what these fellows believed. Well, with that said, that gives us a perfect time to close it. So on behalf of William, on behalf of Chris, thank you guys so much for your time. And anyone listening, thanks for your time and listening to us talk on and on about things that most people seem to not care too much about. And we're glad that you do. So whether or not you like it, there's a good chance we'll probably be back.